and welcome back to another video feature of the Immersive Rules Handbook. Today I am going to give you an update on Disney Springs here in Orlando. 2 years ago I was out here checking out the space and it was as of yet incomplete. So we'll do the complete version now, the updates since that time. Okay, so I am back. As I said in my intro video, I'm looking at Disney Springs. My last visit in 2015, they were just finishing up construction. It wasn't really until the following year in 2016 when everything was in place. And so this particular visit I took in 2017 I think is much more representative of essentially the finished product. Now, that being said, if you know Walt Disney's famous statement about Disneyland never being finished, in a sense you could say that applies to all Disney properties. They have the capital, the resources available such that they can experiment with things, change them as guests' expectations change. This is certainly the case with not just theme parks but shopping malls. And so it's an ability to update your spaces based on guest desires. If you remember Disney California Adventure, that was a really big deal there over time. That made some alterations as people weren't really connecting with the space as much as they do now. So I thought we'd start off looking at the early iterations of what came before Disney Springs. If you visited what used to be both Lake Buena Vista Shopping Village in the 70s, Walt Disney World Village in the 1980s, you know, the mall has constantly changed over time. And in some ways it's a mall much different than, say, Universal City Walk, which in both iterations in Orlando and in Los Angeles are really connected right next door to a theme park. And so it's a case, if you go to what used to be, or what still is, I guess, Downtown Disney in LA, connected to Disneyland Park, that at least is right there next to the theme park. And I have to update and check out that space to see what they've done, if anything, relative to the space in Orlando, Florida. So once in the 90s, this space becomes Downtown Disney. You know, I think it's further on that way into becoming something more than, say, a typical mall. And this is just an image, a few images of the early spaces. As you can see, not unlike what we see today, you have this lagoon, which I think is an effective, effective use of space in that it gives a lot of views to the guests in the restaurants. I'll show you in the actual video the water taxis that take place at the landing, which is the area in here. But this is radically changed over time. This is this is from, I believe, 1987. It's a map of Walt Disney World Village. And as you can see, there is just one big space. It's essentially a typical mall. And there is no, in the legend of the map, there is reference to restaurants and lounges, shops, and so forth. But there's nothing thematic going on in the space itself. So this is radically changing when we get into the era of Disney Springs today. This shot is from 2008. I'll have a few images in here of Disney Springs and Pleasure Island. It turned out I was part of the TIA, the Themed Entertainment Conference, and we were at Disney Springs and Pleasure Island just as it was about to close. Literally the next month, they were sheltering all of Pleasure Island, tearing down the clubs, including the Adventurers Club, which I think was the best space of this whole era of the Disney Springs era, and also Pleasure Island. So, you know, you can see here that this is more of that branded space, something you'd see this McDonald's at, say, Universal City Walk. This we're going to look at. This is the West Side District. This is becoming what they call their expo space, and we'll get into that later in the video when I show you some actual on-site video. And again, this is from 2008. This really does have that branded Universal City Walk look to it. I think you get not as major in terms of the exaggerated facades, storefronts that you see at City Walk with the Giardi Group, but a version of that. And so I think it's a pretty good improvement. This shot here, the Virgin Record Store, and then also Disney Quest. So this is radically changing. Disney Quest was the virtual Disney arcade that failed, and these are no longer there. New venues are there. At the very end is the Cirque du Soleil show, which they've also changed over time. And we'll get into that space there, how that fits into their vision of what they call the expo of the town. This is the Pleasure Island, some of the clubs. When you see these, I guess you could say that in some literal and figurative senses, playing with, learning from Las Vegas, this is almost the decorated shed, but not in the sense maybe that Venturi and others intended in that book, right? I mean, there's nothing really spectacular about this particular front here, this facade. This is the Motion Club, so that was actually where we had our TIA mixers and our conference, and it was pretty cool to see the end of this era while we were there on location for a conference. But maybe as you take a look, this I don't think, I often thought this didn't really fit in with Disney's sense of their high standards of creating themed immersive spaces. So this is a space that this entire mall that I think over time has struggled, has been a space of struggle. This is the Pleasure Island Code of Conduct. It says refrain from rollerblading, skating, offensive language or gestures, lewd conduct, littering, defacing, etc., disruptive behavior, and all other activities prohibited by the Downtown Disney Code of Conduct. So this, I think, draws attention to the fact that there was always a disconnect. There was a disconnect between the sort of level of entertainment they were striving for. I think a quasi version, a mini version of Las Vegas, of the clubs, of the discotheques, the dance halls there, and the Disney theme park vernacular, the Disney theme park foundation that essentially was family, wholesome entertainment. So I think in a sense, the fact that they had security issues at Pleasure Island, the fact that they had unruly guests and so forth, really showed you that this was a challenge trying to get these two worlds to reconcile. I always thought, when Las Vegas did at the MGM, their mini theme park, that just didn't fit. It didn't fit what Vegas is all about in terms of its core identity. Likewise, I think Pleasure Island, they wanted to compete with some of the clubs that you see in downtown Orlando, the very famous clubs, but they couldn't really do that, and they couldn't reconcile these two worlds, the adult club debauchery world, if you will, and the Disney wholesome family entertainment world. So it's hard to reconcile those two. Now this is kind of curious. So throughout Pleasure Island, they had these, quote, historical markers, and it reminds me a little bit of those fake, on this site in 1893, nothing happened plaques, if you've ever seen those in small towns. Kind of pokes fun at the idea of authenticity, history, and place heritage. So I think this is an attempt to do that, right? It says an unverifiable, anecdotal, subjective, theoretical, allegedly purported history, also ersatz. So almost focusing on the fact that it is fake, right? That there's a phoniness to it. And I don't know how well this works for Disney. I don't think Disney needs to do that, right? I think they have enough capital that if they want to create history, they can do it. They have enough money to pump in millions of dollars into an attraction. Check out my video on Pandora and the Avatar world from Animal Kingdom to see exactly how that's the case. So I don't think if they want to do history, they have to poke fun at it or do fake history. So I don't know. Maybe this is another sign of how things didn't work in terms of the theming. Here's another one here talking about Pleasure Island. It's a little blurry. The complete and purely subjective saga of Pleasure Island. So, and talking about these historical plaques, and they even call them ersatz historical plaques. This is one of these that maybe, I don't know, it didn't connect with guests. Maybe it just doesn't seem like it serves any purpose. Here's the entrance to Pleasure Island, and you can see, as you'll see in the video today, how much this has changed. Here are some guests looking at the maps of some of the clubs. They also had the comedy clubs. This is the inside of mannequins. And, some of these clubs are pretty cool. They had some cool features inside of them, but maybe for one reason or another, they just didn't connect with the typical Disney guest. Here's one of the spaces of a cantina inside Pleasure Island. Not spectacular, and that's one of the things I think I would say about the old Pleasure Island and Downtown Disney. Other than a few exceptions like the Disney Store, there weren't a lot of spaces either on the exterior or the interior that I would say were remarkable exemplars of theming or evocative design of some sort. Again, this is a shot of Motion, night shot here. They did some cool stuff with lights at night, so there was some color and so forth. Now, as we're getting into the era of Disney Springs, and in just a bit here, I'm going to talk about what's going on currently And specifically, what were some choices that Disney had in terms of taking an eclectic array of restaurants, shops, spaces, entertainment venues, reworking those. So taking out vendors, putting in new ones, changing the grounds, changing the landscape architecture, changing some of the facades, retheming, and then ultimately telling a story, giving the guest a foundation that they would at a typical theme park. So if you walk into Pandora, the world of Avatar, or if you walk into the non-Disney, the Universal Wizarding World of Harry Potter, there's a story there that happens before the guest enters the space because of that intellectual property that's being brought into the three-dimensional terms in the case of Harry Potter and also in the case of Cameron's Avatar. So doing this in a mall, I think, is a very interesting operation because malls typically, I won't say they're not themed, but they don't have the level of thematic development. They don't have the level of connection to the story in its various levels of depth as you would see at a theme park. It reminds me a little bit, if you flip to the Immersive Worlds Handbook, page 111, I'm talking about Civil War reenactment, and there's specifically a chart. I'm interviewing Gordon Jones, who's an expert on Civil War reenactment, and if you look at chart table 4.43, what I call the A factor, I'm getting at various levels of authenticity that we see evident in communities of historical reenactment. So does someone go for very authentic period clothing and garb that, say, has inside seams? Care is taken at a level such that a person who's not a member of that community, who sees the dress that the person's wearing, might not even say to the person, oh, I really appreciate that you have these inside seams and that you achieve that level of authenticity. But it may matter subjectively to the person doing the reenactment. And so I mention this because I found a very curious article that I'll talk about later in our video tour, and I show you some of the footage of Disney Springs. USA Today, Arthur Levine on June 1st, 2016. Check out the story. It's a really good overview of the backstory and the foundation. Disney Springs, the story behind Disney World's former Downtown Disney. And I want to draw attention to this very last quote because I think it does say something about ultimately what the story behind Disney Springs may or may not mean to the typical guest to the space. So let me read that quote for you. When the expansion is complete, the complex will offer about twice as many locations for Disney World visitors to drop their vacation dollars. Will guests be aware of the intricate story thread that the Imagineers have developed about the pseudo community? Most probably won't. But even if it's on a largely subconscious level, they will appreciate the most harmonious vibe at Disney Springs. That would make the town's early settlers proud. And we'll talk about this later. There's this whole story that in the 1800s, this settler discovered the spring, had some cattle, set up shop, and you see this settler's cabin in the present, which is essentially become the guest services area and also a gourmet burger place. So I want to draw attention to this, and I'll come back to it in the video because I think this really does speak about whether or not the story matters. Do guests care about the level of intricacy in terms of telling a story at a space like Disney Springs? Okay, so in that regard, let me jump back to an image here of Disney Springs, and we'll talk about this later. This is actually their device, right, that's siphoning, that's drawing up water from the springs, and it has the logo, and we'll get into that later. But I thought I'd read for you a very short section of a chapter I just wrote for an urban studies book. And the reason I wanted to talk or read this to you is it describes, I think, the concerns I have about Disney Springs and this new narrative that's being attached, which is a narrative of eras of time, if you will. So this section is called The City as Story. Disney Springs, located in Orlando, Florida, is the most curious of the spaces that are considered in this writing. The project, which began in 2013 and was completed in 2016, represents the reconfiguration of a series of previous shopping and entertainment venues, including Pleasure Island, an unsuccessful adult club and entertainment district that was part of the downtown Disney shopping area. Disney Springs represents a curious form of entertainment remaking. It conflates, rearranges, and redefines 4 eras of time. The first is the prehistory of the Orlando land prior to Disney's acquisition. The second, the entertainment history of the shopping area since the 1970s, which I talked about earlier. The third, the spaces of Disney Springs in the present here, which connect to the fourth temporal era, in which Disney creates a backstory that attempts to explain the temporal evolution of the fictional town. As imagined in the Disney backstory, the town includes a settler's cabin and stable of the mid-1800s, which have been transformed into a fast food restaurant and Disney's guest services center in the present, a town center with Spanish colonial revival-style architecture of the 1920s, a marketplace that utilizes American craftsman architecture of the 1930s, and an exposition center that imagines a previous expo within the town through reclaimed forms of 1950s Googie architecture. Dotting the various architectural and temporal zones of Disney Springs are other historical markers, including a bottling plant repurposed as a Masaharu Morimoto Asian restaurant, an STK Orlando steakhouse made to resemble a historic Orlando train station, complete with an accompanying faux train turnstile, and a created and non-functioning well machine connected to the springs, which is pictured here. The namesake springs of the shopping venue are also fabricated, with colorful glass used to create a visual appealing effect. Local environmentalists took offense to Disney's riffing off of authentic and threatened Florida natural springs, though Disney retorted that its use of the springs as a metaphor was intended to evoke optimism and show respect for regional ecosystems. The uniqueness of the shopping district is not simply located in its conflation of multiple historic periods, but in its willingness to remake what was previously a disparate arrangement of nightclubs, restaurants, and retail venues into a fictional town, complete with historical backstory. And in the writing, I have historical in quotes, and we'll get into that later. It should be noted that the context of Disney Springs, while not situated within urban density and large city life, are reminders of some of the processes of the narrativization of space that will more and more come to define larger cities and urban districts. The ultimate question of the narrativization of space, and specifically whether or not such fictional narratives should be seen as sound urban practices for the remaking of city spaces, is certainly challenging to answer. One clear outcome of the Disney Springs development is its potential conceptual impact on urban design. In terms of future urban projects, it may be beneficial to reorient our focus from functional associations to metaphorical contexts of space. While it may be true that Disney's use of a fictional historic narrative and its metaphorical underpinnings, using the springs, say, as a form of optimism, that it was conditioned by the desire to remake and reconnect a struggling and disparate collection of retail locations in an all-too Disneyfied approach, it may also be the case that the end result allows for new imagination of future urban spaces that, perhaps struggling in some similar senses, make use of metaphor and storytelling as a means of revival. So that's a kind of a, you could say, a theoretical look at some of the issues. And let me jump back in the PowerPoint to some earlier images. And what I want to do then is reconnect with this idea of what exactly Disney is doing in terms of the theming. Is it appropriate or not? And then when I take you through the live video and stills that I shot on site and do some voiceover, I'll get into more of what each space is like. There are four main spaces we'll talk about, and I'll get into these different historical periods that are entailed in each. The Really Good USA Today article, by the way, makes mention of the fact that one of the Imagineers basically said that what defines each of these four spaces within Disney Springs is either their function and or, I guess it's an and or, is their function and or their time period that is referenced by this backstory. So if you're taking a shopping mall, you have some opportunities to do maybe one of three or four different things. You could either choose to not theme, you could do minimal theming, you could do totally immersive theming, or you could do more postmodern branded forms of design or theming. So, and I'm not saying one of these is right or wrong. There's no right or wrong. It depends on the context of the space, what you're trying to deliver to the guests in terms of your deliverables. Certainly the capital, the resources you have available. If you're Disney, you can do a lot of this stuff very well. You can try some experiments. If it fails, pump a few more million into it, redo it, see what happens. When I worked for the Six Flags Corporation back in the day, in the 90s, we didn't have a lot of that capital to do some of these projects. So there's a lot dependent on what's available to you, what you're trying to deliver, and the context of your spaces and so forth. But I think it's an entirely different project when you're doing theming and backstory development in a retail space like a mall versus a theme park. So option one is to do no theming. These are the shops at North Star, which is a ski resort in North Lake Tahoe, and certainly very classy. The defining elements here are the design, the structures, the use of space here, the landscaping, and so forth. In this way, you have continuity between one venue and the next. Brand A, Brand B, Brand C, Restaurant 1, Restaurant 2, and so forth. So the continuity is provided by the overall design aesthetic. It's nothing like, say, Universal City Walk, which really radically juxtaposes different styles in one place. And also, as I'll show you later, like with Horton Plaza in San Diego, doesn't do anything startling in terms of the pedestrian flow, in terms of the signage, in terms of how you're trying to move guests through the space. So it's a very practical, functional design, and I would say a very classy design as well. This is an example. This is the one of the big digital malls in Singapore, and you can see here there's no emphasis on theming. It's very functional space down to actual the sizes of each store. The only story being told is the speed of your laptop, the game being played, Grand Theft Auto, the brand, Galaxy, Samsung, whatever it happens to be. So again, no theme being told. No story being told, no foundation for a backstory, because you want the guest presumably to go in the store, buy the camera, and all that they know, the only thing being told to them is this entire mall is all about digital technology. And that's the type of mall it is, so you don't need a theme for it. Now, in the Reader in Themed Immersive Spaces, which is the latest collection that came out, if you haven't had a chance to read this, you can buy it in hard copy. You can also download it for free. Just go to the ETC Press website through Carnegie Mellon University. So I have a few charts in there that I thought would be pretty relevant to what we're talking about today. The first of these is Table 1.1, and this talks about the modes of theming and immersion. And it basically says that you can use architecture, material culture design, narrative technology performance, and the guest, her or himself, to draw on theming and immersion. So in the case of Disney Springs, we have a lot of architecture, material design, and then the narrative is the text or backstory that expresses the purposes or the meanings of the space. So this is really what I want to get into in this video, taking you through some of the Disney Springs spaces today, is what is that text or backstory historically that is used to orient the guests in the space? And as the excellent USA Today article mentioned, does it matter to the guest? Does it matter as much as it would, say, in a theme park like the world of the Pandora world of Avatar, the Wizarding World of Harry Potter? Table 1.3 talks about some of the source materials for theming and immersion. Some of these are relevant to, like brand. If you go to BMW World, which is not a mall, but I would say it's a space that has one of the most evocative and yet subtle uses of branding backstory to deliver to the guest. And check out my video on BMW World. So that's using a brand, a revered automobile brand, to connect to the guest. The one that you could say is going on, I guess, at Disney Springs is time, period, or epic. So if you go to Luxor, Las Vegas, more in the past, ancient Egypt is being used evocatively to tell the story. So we're getting time and the idea of re-inhabitation or remaking of space at Disney Springs. So look out for that as we go through the spaces today. This is very key to what we're talking about now. So chart 1.1, dimensions of theming. So you can choose to, these are sort of posed as opposites, right? So representational versus abstract. Representational, ghost town theming, abstract, universal city walk. And some of these will overlap. Realist versus metonomic. Metonomic would be using some key symbols to orient the guest in space, whereas realist would mean I'm going to develop an entire Old West town for you to experience in all its delights. The HBO excellent theme park version of Westworld, the remake of that as a series, which is very clever, I think, wants to take a very realist approach because that's part of the story, right, is to really break down this issue of the front and the backstage with the guest. And of course, there's a whole horrific technological apocalyptic element to this, which I won't give away, which you probably know. And then last, conventional versus postmodern. So these are some ways that you can approach theming or immersive design, and we'll go through some of these here now. So minimal theming is appropriate to malls. And I would say if you go to a lot of malls, this is the brand at Americana in Southern California, this is the approach. You could see one thing, you have storefronts here, which bear some of the semblance of their logos, their brand identity, if there's smells associated with them, like Abercrombie and Fitch or Lush Cosmetics, you're going to get those taken in a sensory aspect as a guest, as opposed to the overarching theme or narrative that is enveloping, or I would say stitching together these disparate elements, as I talked about in that short piece from the Urban Studies reader. So multi-use space, as you can see, there's retail space on the bottom, and up top is very expensive condos. Cable car, so playing off of some of the Disney ideology or Disney narrative of small town America. The lamp posts, right? There's a lot about the street design that is somewhat reminiscent, I would say, of Main Street USA from Disney lore. And then the iron wrought structure here, elevator in the back, the clock, the classical design here, the statuary and so forth, the water feature. It's a very beautiful mall. Very bourgeois, mall in terms of its aesthetic, but a very beautiful one. So essentially, excuse me one second, there isn't really a lot of theming going on here, right? It's a design approach that creates atmospherics, creates sensibilities, emotions with the guest, but I'm not, as a guest, walking through the space and saying, oh, these people have an identity, and this is who they are, and as I'm shopping or going through the space, I should remember them because, right, there is no attention to this. It's more in line with that chart on this side, right? More abstract and metonymic. Maybe, I wouldn't necessarily call it postmodern. So that's Americana at Brand. The next one here is the Grove, and this one is certainly directly influenced by Disney. You see the streetcar going through the streets here. You see really nice attention to architecture and design. A lot of typical storefronts, Cheesecake Factory, but they're allowed in Barnes & Noble, but they're allowed to fit in a sense. You take away some of that exterior storefront identity of the typical brand and you bring it more inside, right? Because you want it to fit in with the design scheme or schema of the space at hand. You have the statuary, you have the fountains. Very nice design here, certainly, I would say. And then here's another shot of some of the fountains, and you can see it's a really good attention. You have some resemblance here of a typical movie theater in terms of seeing the movies here, but it's much more subdued, right? It's not as typical as you might think about in like a big flashy theater that has lights and giant billboards. So it's a little more subdued given the design aesthetic. So that's no theming. Now, on total opposite end of that is what we call postmodern theming. Universal City Walk, great example of this. The brands are speaking, the logos are speaking, over the top, eclectic space, exciting space, really getting you moving, the signage, everything in the space is trying to attract you to the storefronts, to the restaurants, and so forth. Totally different space, but also postmodern. This is the Horton Plaza in San Diego, and what's cool here is what they've done with some of the color schemes and really disrupting the sight lines of the guest, right? So you're doing this as you're walking through the space, as opposed to that cruciform design. The cruciform design, right, basically takes it takes the out and back concept. So we have a typical store here, a Sears store, which is maybe a bad example because some of those stores are, malls are struggling in today's day and age. So actually the Disney Springs narrative, I should say to you as well, is a key one to follow if you're studying themed immersive design. But in the cruciform design, you have these hub stores, anchor stores. And the idea is that if I want to go to Macy's, I go this way. And then as I'm going to Macy's, all the stores and restaurants and entertainment venues dotting the spaces in between each of the anchor stores will be visited by me. Casino design also may play off of some of this, because you're trying to think about the flow of traffic such that we maximize the guest time spent in any of the venues, spending money, purchasing products, buying services. This kind of disrupts this, and there's a lot of I think, disagreement about the effect of this and is it effective. I think it's a wonderful space. It's showing a little bit the signs of the time. It's aging, but it's a great example of really overturning our expectation of a mall and how you orient yourself as a guest in that space. Here's another postmodern design. Out front here, you would see this really cool Burning Man praying mantis that has some stuff it does at night. This is the Container Mall in the East Fremont District in Las Vegas, just past the Heart Attack Grill, which is a reference point there. But it's a really cool mall that uses these container type structures and has a lot of new and eclectic stores, concepts. It's really a much more trendy and avant-garde mall, and I definitely recommend you check that out. So it also has, for me, a very postmodern feel to it. Now, this is opposite of that. This is what I call maximal or maximum theming. This is the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, the Universal properties. And of course, this is not a mall, but the retail spaces, as you go in the various shops, they are all integrated within the space of the theme park. And I think it's a very effective approach, because basically it allows the guests to seamlessly move from one space to the next. I just did the 3D ride, and now I can go into the Gringotts Bank, and there's an audio or not an audio animatronic, a robotic bank teller. I can then go into a store and get some of the special beer that they have and so forth. And so it's an example of an approach to theming that basically says the immersion is going to be total. If we're going back to that chart on page 111, in terms of authenticity and Civil War reenactment, this gets us, in terms of guest subjectivity, into that level of total immersion, approaching total immersion, as opposed to the no theming where the guest isn't being told a story. You can still be immersed in the space. I could still go to that digital mall in Singapore and be super excited about getting my cameras or my computers or whatever, but I'm not being told the story, so I'm not approaching the space and interacting with it in the same sense that I would be if I'm thinking about the Muggles or whatever at Wizarding World of Harry Potter. So I think as we think about this today, as we move back to Disney Springs, I'll take you through some of the spaces. And again, this story is a very good one because it asks us whether or not it matters. Does it matter that there's the story being told to you when you're shopping? To what extent do you reflect upon that story? Does it affect how you interact with the spaces and so forth? And that's really, I think, the question we're asking today in this video that I'm calling Theming's Backstory. So let me now take you inside Disney Springs and show you some of the sights and the sounds and give you a few more of my interpretations of each of the spaces, the 4 spaces at Disney Springs. I think at the end of this video, and you can offer this in the comments, give your opinion. Do you think the backstory works? Is it effective? If so, why? And ultimately, does the backstory impact how we interact with the various venues of Disney Springs as guests? So let's take a look at the spaces now. Okay, we'll begin the tour here, and we're starting at the springs here. And again, the springs, if you've read some of the literature, was chosen as a metaphor, as a symbol, because of its significance to Florida. There is some contestation by local environmentalists about the use of the springs, but for Disney, it appears to be a symbol of optimism. Water gets used in a lot of attractions around the world, so it's not surprising. And I think the way they've used water as a central feature in the mall is a smart way of interconnecting what I've said earlier, these disparate spaces. I should say that on the day of my visit to Disney Springs, I was accompanied by architect Gordon Grice, who I've written with. He's contributed to a lot of my collections, and it was great to have his expertise because he's an architect and I'm not, and it allowed him to comment on some of the things we saw. And as we're walking through this section, and we'll talk about the sections later, but we're in the town center, the central business area, which has the Spanish Revival architecture intended to reference the 1920s. We were really drawn to this because, this does establish a central point. It's not quite the weenie in the Walt Disney sense of, say, the Matterhorn at Disneyland or some of the other weenies that you see at Disney theme parks, but it is something that has, as you can see here, the logo establishes the identity of Disney Springs and gives it that sense of history that they're looking for. So the next few slides here, we'll look at some other examples of establishing as much of this backstory as is evident as can be seen. This is near the parking garages, and so you see here you have some of the branding of the springs water and also the oranges. So it has some of the obvious trappings of Florida citrus and of course water referencing the natural springs. So it's one way to establish a identity, a backstory for the guest. I think as you'll see throughout this journey, the backstory is definitely not explicit, and that's one of the things we'll address later in the video, maybe in terms of some of your thoughts about the theming. So here's the Springs Bottling Company, repurposed as a Morimoto restaurant. I read online there was a really good architectural blog saying that it in some ways resembles the Cannery restaurant in Newport Beach, which I haven't been to. This is, by the way, the old mannequins, part of Pleasure Island, part of the landing that it's called today. Here's another great example of a really attractive logo, Disney Springs, the source of inspiration. It's a really nice looking logo there. Here's another version of that on two food trucks just outside the balloon attraction that is really the only ride per se, if you will, at Disney Springs. We're looking at more of the Spanish architecture. I've got some noticeable artifacts on my lens this morning. I didn't clean it, apologize for that, but I think you'll get the idea. I'm going to take you actually to show you the parking garage because that was an interesting feature. Gordon caught a glimpse of this, and we took a pit stop and looked at it. At first we thought these were real plants, and we talked with a guest services lead. I'll mention his work or his conversation with us later, but he informed us that indeed these are plastic plants. They looked real to us, and he mentioned that it would just be too much of an effort to water real plants on the scale of, or in the number that is represented there. Here's some of the Spanish Revival architecture. Nicely done. You can see the fountain here, very serene and nice looking section of Disney Springs. And one of the things I think we'll talk about throughout this video is as you're walking through this, you get a feel of architecture and design. You get a feel of temporality, of time period, a certain era, but you don't necessarily maybe take in the same kind of cues that you take in, let's say, if you were in a theme park. Now this is kind of a pretty curious section, and Gordon spotted this, and it was just a nice, sort of pedagogical way of looking at this. On the left, you're going to see this is where we have the marketplace theme land, one of the four, and that's the American Craftsman architecture of the 30s. And then on the right, that's the really right, we'll circle this here, right where that under construction areas, that's where the two eras meet. So on the left you have the Craftsman, on the right you have the Spanish Revival architecture. So we have two different periods, and one of the questions becomes, and I'll actually show you this on the map so you get a better sense of where we're coming to join the two areas there, the town center and the marketplace. So Gordon's query was, to what extent does this speak of effective theming or not? And I think that's a question you have to answer because a lot of theming is subjective. But it is a curious moment, right, to say like you have these two architectural periods meeting. In terms of reuse and reclamation, which I think is a great metaphor to build on here at Disney Springs, clever in many ways, the question becomes like, would this really happen? And again, the funny thing is both the left and the right look rather new. They don't speak of the 20s or the 30s, of course. Now this is a shot from Berlin, and I wanted to show you this because you could certainly argue in Disney's defense that we can go to cities around the world and see contrasting architectural styles, not block by block, but literally building by building. I mean, look at just the three different styles that we see here. A more historic one on the right, in the center, more modern, postmodern, contemporary, on the left, a kind of functional, modernist, building, maybe an office building. So just to point out that in Disney's defense. These were some images from, I think this was from 2015, when they were putting up a lot of the signage, and they were, of course, closing off some of the old areas of Pleasure Island, indicating that, it was under construction. And so this again shows you a little bit of how things have changed over time. Be sure to check out my video from 2015 because it's another rumination on a lot of this construction. The Planet Hollywood changed remarkably. They took out the very garish, branding that I've never loved about Planet Hollywood as a brand, and they installed a much more subdued conservatory theme, and I'll show you some of that in a little bit. And I think that fits in a lot nicer with the theming that they've done at Disney Springs, which is nothing like it. Earlier in the video we talked about the postmodern theming of City Walk. Nothing like that by any means. Let's take a look at the 4 sections we'll consider today. These are the 4 theme lands, if you will. The town center, which is right there towards the bottom, and again that's the reminiscent of the 1930s, or I'm sorry, 1920s Spanish Revival. Coming up next, you have the marketplace, and that actually is the 1930s American craftsman architecture. And you get a sense of how this has changed over time. And the marketplace, by the way, that's where the original Buena Vista, the Disney World Village was, if you're paying attention from the beginning. The landing is there in the center. That used to be Pleasure Island. We'll check that out towards the end of the video. And then our last one's on the left here coming up, and that is the west side. And that in downtown Disney was called, the West District, so they've kept it as West. And the theming that we'll talk about in a little bit is developed to say that there was an exposition in the 1950s that took place in this town. So you have these different eras, and of course I mentioned earlier you also have the settler's cabin, and the backstory is that in the 1880s there was a settler, or 1800s, I don't know if it was 1880s, a settler who came in and settled this area, found the springs to water, to feed his cattle, give them water, and so forth. Sorry, the video is shaky here. It's one of these things when I've got my Blackmagic camera, I'm just running and gunning. I'm not like setting up a tripod and trying to get any steady shots. And I think to some extent we get used to that with YouTube, with the lack of steady videos. Here is my exposure's a little off as well. I know I'm pointing out all the flaws in my video, but this is an on-the-fly commentary. But this is the settler's cabin. I'll take you inside in a bit. The burger restaurant, and then to the right is the Disney Guest Relations, and that's where we had the extended conversation with really nice gentlemen from Guest Relations who just talked to us for seemed like 40 minutes that we talked about just the different time periods that we noticed, and also just the sense of theming, what he could explain to us. Because one of the things you're going to note as you go through Disney Springs, and if you've been there you might notice this, you don't really get a sense of an explicit backstory. You're not going to get historical plaques. Strangely enough, I mentioned earlier that they took away some of those historical plaques. You're not going to get that. You're basically going to get very subtle referencing of time and place throughout the various spaces, the 4 theme lands of Disney Springs. And again, that's up to you to decide as we near the end of the video and we ask some questions about to what extent does this equate with effective theming or not. And I think it's a subjective issue, but one we should address. So here's the Welcome Center on the left. You can see it has a little bit different architecture compared to what we saw in the Spanish Revival. And I thought overall they did a nice job here. They have the front porch. There is no main street per se inside Disney Springs, and that's one curious thing to mention in terms of Disney Main Street versus non-Main Street and approaches to theming. But it's something to consider as you talk about how exactly you can create nostalgia or a sense of place or history. Here's a deluxe burger, and I thought they did a really nice job. I'll take you inside because they have some excellent theming inside that I think really references bits and pieces of this temporal history in the 4 zones that we're going through today. And by the way, in the Guest Relations center, there's some really nice conceptual drawings that were done by artists that also give us that sense of history that is subtle here at Disney Springs, but is still important to establishing, presumably to the guest, a sense of time, era, reclamation, reuse, remaking in each of the zones. So, it's been a big trend as of late. The burger restaurants, adjust the exposure a little bit, you can see better. The higher end burger restaurants, and it's something you see here as well. So on the walls you get trappings of the history that we're talking about. And again, it's something to think about. To what extent should you give a guest reference, say, to a story, to a time period, to a theme? Do you do it implicitly or explicitly? Do you do it directly or indirectly? Subtlety or hit people over the head? I was noticing some of the beams here, the construction, really kind of nice in terms of what they did with the interior crafting of the architecture. Gordon's there on the left. We're kind of looking around and just getting a lay of the land here in terms of what is going on. Here's some of the stuff that I thought was kind of cool in terms of the reference points on the wall, in terms of some of the signage and so forth. We'll zip through the back here, running and gunning, just getting some shots of the interior. I thought a really nice job, like with the light fixtures here. The ceiling tile, you see that in a lot of classic bars these days, that really nice, I'm sure that's period. I don't know where they got that from, but there are places that sell that kind of reclaimed material. Really classy, I think, to see in a bar or in a place like this. You see the sliding barn type doors here. We learned from I want to say maybe his name was Danny, but I might be getting that wrong. But he was mentioning that a lot of the stuff you see here is trying to say that this is the space that the settler who settled, and there's the expo to your right. I think I'll get a close-up of that. But he was basically telling us that it's trying to give people a feel of a stable where the horses were. This presumably would be the stable of the settler. And then when we go in guest relations, that I think was the family's cabin. This is the reference of that expo area that we'll look at later, the Googie 1950s architecture, which is the west side, what was formerly the west side and still is the west side. The difference being today they've added some of the train tracks to show you what was the remainder of a train that presumably came in out of town from that area and then went all the way through town to the what's now the STK, that's made to resemble the train station, the historic I think it's like 1889 or something is the reference point I have of the train station on Church Street in downtown Orlando. You see another example here suggesting a time period 1921. Presumably, right, this is, it's the edge of town center, so presumably they're referencing the same restaurant. You see some of the nice brickwork here. This is one of the highlights for me, the interior of the restaurant, just what they did with all the wood, the brickwork, the signage, giving us those historical points of reference that are subtle but still establish to some degree the story that's being told here at Disney Springs. Just getting a lay of the land here, a little more of the restaurant. Didn't have a chance to check out the food, but I'm sure it's pretty good. Disney restaurants are always very good, I found. Here's some more historical photos. I'm assuming those are just archival photos that they've selected. I don't have a sense that those have any connection to purported people. I mean, you never do get a moment where it says, here is the founding settler, and here's his name, and here's his, what he looks like, or anything like that. So you don't get that level of storytelling that you would, of course, in a theme park. Now, so here we are in the guest relations, which is just next door. So this is, again, supposedly the cabin of the settler and his family when they settled in this area in the 1800s. We're talking then to, and I don't have the audio going because obviously I didn't get a clearance from him, but he was so helpful. He gave us a tour of guest relations, and then he was pointing to these various conceptual drawings, and each of these again correlates with one of the four theme lands that we're looking at. So you see the Spanish Revival there, and the one on the left, the town center there, I'm sorry, that would be the marketplace. And then we're going to flip around. I'll get you some video later, I think, of the expo schematic drawings. And he did point out, there it is here from the 1950s. So check out that train track, that elevated train. That's going to come back to as a reference point when we walk through the that West Side theme land. So I think I just have the camera like this because we were talking to him, and I was taking some still photos, and he was telling us the whole story. But he went into a lot of detail about the subtlety of the design. He talked about the fact that some of the signs you see, there's a sign we may get a shot of if I took a photo of a train, and he said that that was the result of a few Disney Springs workers who suggested to upper management that they create this faux advertisement for the train, and I think that might be on the outside of the STK steakhouse. So we'll look out for that later as we continue the tour. Again, he also mentioned some of the history of what went into making the various theme lands what they are in terms of the theming. Talked a lot about the architecture. He talked about the sensibility of design. So certainly what we got from him in terms of the approach of the Walt Disney Imagineers was that they weren't going for something very explicit. So it's a more subtle approach to theming, and that's why in my earlier discussion in the studio, I suggested to you that essentially this is one of those very subtle approaches to theming as opposed to something more explicit. Here's the inside of guest relations. It's decent. I like the concept paintings. I don't know if this, I guess this is trying to be very old-timey, and give you that very classic era of design. And those of you design aficionados can, point out the design styles we're seeing and the eras that they reference. Here's some pretty explicit images of the springs that you see here. So this is again referencing Disney's history of springs. These again I thought were really nice. So this is our expo area of the 1950s. We'll take a look at that later. And the only thing I'll say about this is, these are rather hidden away. Unless you go in guest relations, you're not necessarily going to make this out. And I believe those there are is that the cabin in the distance on the right that we're maybe seeing? Again, it gives you a sense of place. It gives you a sense of history. I'm trying to think of there are some other malls out there in Dubai that use different time periods more via the cultural associations of the time periods. There's one mall in particular where they have all different theme lands or sections of the mall based on the cultures themselves. But this is maybe one of the first that tries to conflate and connect together. This would be the landing, which is the transportation hub that we'll take a look at a little later with the very cool boat type cars that we'll look at. So here is I referenced earlier the STK steakhouse. And so this here, when we talked to our friend in guest relations, he said that is supposed to be the train turnstile. So the train would get turned around here and presumably would go in the other direction on the other set of tracks. Now here's the curious thing. You don't see a lot of, I was poking around trying to find reference of the train tracks throughout Disney Springs. Didn't really find any of them other than here. We'll get a glimpse of them in the elevated form, which I'm assuming is part of the same train line, though it could be a different era because that seems more modern. So maybe the train, I don't know. Again, there are a lot of fill in the gaps kind of thing because you don't necessarily know exactly what they're intending in terms of this history. And maybe that's a good approach because they're not trying to give a history lesson here. They're more trying to give you the ambiance, the feel of history that a lot of historians and archaeologists have talked about in writing. So here we are at the landing. This gives you a reference point of where we are. And again, this used to be Pleasure Island. So this is a radical transformation, basically from the ground up of everything. Took out the old clubs, put in brand new venues, and you see the end result, what it is. And I guess for me at this point in the tour, as we're looking at the steakhouse and talking about this, faux history, which, by the way, if you read architectural blogs and some of the critical journalism that's been done in Disney Springs, there was criticism of this backstory effect of theming. Basically, people said you shouldn't create fake history. I would argue that all history is constructed. Of course, in this case, there's no, there is some truth here in the sense that we think of history, with springs and so forth. And I'll show you in a second. There is a real train station that is, alluded to with the STK Steakhouse. So there is referencing of history. But I guess the other thing is because we're in a retail space of a shopping mall, we maybe allow them a little more room, if you will, for experimentation and for twisting some of the lines of history. So I'm showing you this because I'm in a second going to show you the a photo of the actual station, presumably the actual station this is based on in downtown Orlando. I didn't have a chance to go there, but you can see it has a really historic look to it, and I thought if I put these side by side, it's kind of obvious, right? You see the clear resemblance. And so, I mean, this is a nice way. I've often said in malls that I've focused on, if you can reference local history and pay some homage to it, it's a nice, I think, way of saying something about the fact that you recognize there is a history here that is significant beyond the consumerism of the history that's being created by Disney. Here's a few other reference points to transportation. So this is very near, I believe, the Morimoto restaurant. There's that image. So that's the one that our friend in guest relations said was the suggestion of some folks who worked at the park. So that's kind of cool. Here's the Expo elevated train track, and there's the House of Blues. We learned from our friend in guest relations that that tower was actually whoever owns the House of Blues actually found that somewhere. Maybe it was in Texas and had it transported here. So very historic look to it. Again, you see that nice elevated train track. Here's another clear reference point of history. And all of these I've been showing you the last few slides are points that are almost, I would call them historical markers. Again, the bottling plant that is reclaimed as the Morimoto restaurant. And this is, at this point here, we see the layering of history, right? You have that first era of history before Disney. The second era would be when it was, it was Mannequins, right? Yeah, Mannequins Club. And then it becomes, this fictional bottling plant, and then it becomes Morimoto. So you have like these different levels of history, of temporality, of time that are being referenced. And for me, it's a fun way, I guess, to play with time and history. Again, the critics would say that it's having too much fun with history and that it maybe gives people a distorted viewpoint. But again, there's not a pedagogical goal here. This is not a museum space. In a theme park, you could argue with this a little more if you're doing, the old, I'm pointing out some of the, I thought very nice, facade front here of the restaurant. Gordon and I had a chance to grab a bite to eat, and it was pretty good, I would say. Now here is Victoria Gardens. This is a mall in Southern California, right near Riverside. This actually is a very interesting approach, I think, where they used signage and historical plaques. I would say in some ways superior to what is being done at Disney Springs. You get the two layers of history, the old and the new, with the branding. And they also have these very cool maps that reference Victorian history and give the guest a reference point of a little bit of life and culture at that time period. So another way that you could do this that maybe is a little more effective than the Disney Springs approach. So we'll look at the town center here. And again, the town center is, I think, in many ways laid out as a traditional mall, as a traditional series of retail spaces. And I suppose for me, one of the questions is, if you're doing a themed mall versus an unthemed mall, to what extent are you relying on that backstory of theming that is really the framing or foundation rather of this video. I think in a lot of malls, like if you go to Mall of America in Minnesota, there's Camp Snoopy. There are spaces there that have theming to them, but so much emphasis is on the retail, on the branding, on what's being sold there. And that's always, I think, a point of contention, because if you do too much emphasis on the theme, although it draws together all the brands, all the services, as I talked about earlier, it also then takes away from maybe the ability of merchants to sell what they're trying to sell. So it's a, I guess, a sticking point, you could say, in terms of looking at whether or not theming is effective. Now, as I'm walking through the space here, again, taking in the nice architecture and the nice stores and so forth, I was thinking with Gordon, like, well, to what extent is this necessary? Am I getting any reference points? Am I taking those in? Am I internalizing anything about the settler, his family, about these different historical eras or epochs that we experience as we walk through? And I guess our conclusion was probably not. Now, this is a really nice section here where you get this really dramatic interior space. It's a little hard to see here, but so this is, again, what you might see in a traditional mall. This isn't necessarily radical in the sense that they're doing anything different here. Some of the brands you see, like Lucky Jeans on the right, you would see these in many malls around the world. So in that sense, I mean, there's something traditional, I think, to any shopping mall. As shopping malls continue to struggle with relevance, as box stores and brick and mortar venues, retail spaces struggle because of online retailing, and I believe in 2017 for the holidays in the United States, it was the first time ever that more people spent, greater amount of money in the online retailing on Cyber Monday versus Black Friday going to the stores in history. So I've been thinking about this and formulating some ideas for the future to say that basically, and here's a map. It's just showing you the map of that interior space. And what I'm going to do then is we're going to walk out and we'll take I guess it's a left on this map, but we'll just go straight out that building. I'll show you the Planet Hollywood, and then we're going to walk into the next theme land. But basically, it's a point I think to think about is that if malls and retail spaces want to be more relevant and compete against virtual and online retailing and all the apps and the social media that's selling products often without even stepping in a retail space, then you have to design experiences. That's the one thing to think about, going back to Pine and Gilmore's experience economy. And I think you have to attend to the architecture, attend to the design, attend to the material culture, because people want something maybe that is different than just a bunch of stores. On the right there, before we lose it, that's Planet Hollywood. Again, radical redesign. If you remember my first shot, which had all the garish over-the-top branding. So it's kind of cool to think about, just about how they considered this in the point of trying to establish something more subtle to fit in with the space. The AMC on the left there, we're beginning basically the entry into the west side. And I do have to say, as we're walking through this space here, this open courtyard, I remember when I visited this in 2015, at first I thought that was the Springs right there. I had no idea. And of course, it's much grander than that. But I have to say, this to me is just a little bit, it's a teeny bit generic, I guess. I don't know if I really feel anything here. It feels like any mall right here. It maybe doesn't have that sense of Disney appeal, the ambiance, the atmospherics. Now, I will say this. You'll see some signage. They're still suggesting that things are under construction. And as of taking this video, I just learned 2 or 3 months after it, they opened a brand new themed eatery. I'm trying to think where it is. It might be in the landing, but don't quote me. But basically, it has some very interesting theming and performance stuff going on in addition to the food. So my hope is that a lot of this open space we see here could be developed over time, because I just don't see a real purpose for it. I don't know if there are musical acts at play. I know near the landing there's a nice sound stage that has some of that potential for performance. But for me, this area maybe could be developed a little bit more extensively in terms of the theming. Again, it's something for you to consider. I think if you're specifically studying themed and immersive design, if you're doing work in the industries that we're talking about today, then maybe there's something to consider in terms of the value of creating spaces that stand out for the guest. And just as a reference point, again, we are starting the tour of the west side. I'll show it here on the map. This was, very present in the old downtown Disney. And I think as we walk through this space, I'd like you to consider just to what extent Disney was successful or not in weaving together the different brands here. You're going to see the Cuban restaurant. You're going to see what is the House of Blues, the Cirque Show, which I think is being revitalized, the Splitsville, the themed bowling bar venue. So, just ask yourself, to what extent were they able to weave together these different brands and different elements? And I say this because I think in the town center and in the marketplace, yeah, you have the Lego store next to the Disney store. But, I don't know how different they are architecturally. And those spaces, of course, have been, in a sense, redesigned. If you go to the Disney store, I probably don't have a video or stills of that. They've taken the facade that used to be there with Downtown Disney, and they gave it that American Craftsman feel to it, which is kind of cool. It's that same thing when I remember going to the Jules Verne steampunk version of Space Mountain at Disneyland Paris, Euro Disneyland back in 2004, and it was really cool to see a different take on it. And that's always fascinating, where Disney will take a property and theme it or develop it architecturally, thematically for the culture in question. So taking Twilight Zone Tower of Terror to Japan and altering it because of the different reference points of the media, the IP, the intellectual property that informs that ride. And of course, that's changing as we speak with Guardians of the Galaxy, but I diverge a little bit. I just had to show you that Starbucks because it was cool, but also very different and divergent, I would say, in terms of just what that is as a brand and as a service compared to some of the other things we're going to see, the Harley Davidson and so forth. So this for me is the most divergent or disparate collection of different brands and services. And I guess the question becomes, did they tie it together? Well, look right there, right in front of the Starbucks, you see that elevated train line. I wonder to what extent, it just popped in my head, but the High Line in New York City, which is a brilliant reclaimed space, turning a elevated train line into a park. I wonder to what extent what we just saw there references that, if at all. You never know. Design is one of those things, right? We can maybe track this down, but it might be challenging to do so. I really do love this Starbucks. I think it's a very cool design choice that they made. By the way, if you're wondering, am I just, did I drink too much coffee or something? Why is my camera flipping around like this? One of the things I'm doing, and this is why it doesn't work right so great, when I'm going through a theme park or a theme space, I'm doing still shots, and so my video camera is slanting as I'm trying to capture still shots. And if I had time, I certainly would have taken time to do flawless as possible video and also stills and so forth. But Gordon and I spent, I want to say, about 5 to 6 hours. It was a pretty long time that we spent here this day at Disney Springs. And I'll make the point that, and actually we're seeing on the right there, that elevated train line again. That is, I guess key in establishing this as a 1950s themed expo town center. But I'll make the point that if you get a chance to do this kind of work, to go out with a colleague and check out a theme park or a retail space and do what Gordon Grice, my colleague, calls ambulatory research, it's a great opportunity to compare notes, to take some video, to develop a paper, an article, or a video like this. So just a little plug for that. Now, as we're looking at the elevated train line on the right, when we were talking to our really astute friend in guest relations, he was mentioning that the idea behind this is the 50s, and in the 1950s, the town leaders decided to create an exposition. And I think what you'll see, the Cirque du Soleil dome down there, or tent, is supposed to be the expo center. And so in a sense, what Disney has done is to take a structure and to backtrack and say this is what the earlier use was. Of course, people might say, well, we know that this was created for the Cirque show, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there was an actual exposition. And one of the curious things for me was I was trying to understand, what, you don't mean a world expo, right? And so I guess it's just the idea that they created some town exposition. I don't have the demographic points of how big Disney Springs is as a community, but that would sort of lend itself to a larger community than what I assume if I'm walking through, say, the Landing, the town center, the marketplace. Now, of course, the Landing has all this transportation. So maybe that makes the point that over time this grew to be a really big community. But you never get demographic reference points. You never get a sensibility of who the people are. You don't get a sense of how many people, the population. You don't get a sense of lifestyle, of what they're doing, albeit from a few reference points of the farmer and his family. You do get the idea that they created this town center and it became a place of mercantile, of business activities and so forth. We're looking at Splitsville. Again, you'll see Splitsville. There's one in Las Vegas. There's another of the train lines, the elevated train lines. Those also serve as it looks like there are some, pipes there for gas, electricity, and so forth. And they also serve, of course, as eating areas, as shade from the sun in Orlando, which can be, pretty extreme. So as we're going through this, I guess I'll just ask you, do you think they're successful here? By the way, the AMC, we were debating this, but we don't think that that's intentional, that the M is, maybe that was wind damage or something like this. Orlando has gone through a share of pretty major storms in the last year or so, so perhaps that's wind damage. But it's one of these points where we were sort of joking like, well, is that supposed to be a vintage feel going along with the 1950s, the reclaimed feel of all the 4 theme lands, and maybe it's supposed to be a more weathered effect? Probably not. But again, it's something, if you're looking at design in a serious sense, you might ask those sorts of questions just to look at what are they up to here. Now, I wanted to give you some comparative points. So this is the modern day, and then next is my image from, this would be from 2008. So I wanted to show you these, and then in a bit I'll do side by side, because I think what they've done is they've taken away the 2008 feel of it being more like City Walk. You see that on the right, and the left is modern day. I think it's a classier feel to it. You can see even they've changed some of the sidewalk and so forth. Now here's that elevated train line. Again, this was a key point with our friend in guest relations. She said this really establishes that train line, that you can follow it all the way down, that these line up perfectly, being, the train track that you would have experienced, I guess, in the 50s. So I think if you looked at this, and if you know construction, and I don't, with the ironwork here, maybe you'd say, yeah, these indeed reference 1950s welding or construction approaches. And that, I think, would be key. If you were a history buff, you'd want to look at this and say, yeah, they did an authentic job with these train tracks. But, they're interesting. I would say as a feature, they establish a little bit of that subtle history that we've been talking about today in this video. And they also are nice to look at, and they establish a very functional thing for the guests, which is allowing them to partake in some shade from the hot sun in Orlando. Gordon and I are looking down here at the springs, and we determined that these are actually, we thought there was like a faux depth, but they're actually fairly deep. If you look at some of the early videos that have been done when they were constructing Disney Springs, they paid a lot of attention to the detail here. So what they did was they actually painted, glass painting type approach, the bottom of the springs to give it that really luminescent look in daytime. And then at night, unfortunately, I didn't get to visit at night. I did back when in 2008 with Pleasure Island and so forth, but I didn't get a chance to visit at night. And I guess it's just spectacular when they have the springs lit up. So the next time I'm in Orlando, I'm going to have to check it out and get a sense of just what it looks like at night. But for me, this is a nice central point. It's not a weenie per se in Disney's, sensibility of that term, but it does give the guests, I think, something that establishes the identity. I mean, this is really the key foundation of this, the namesake, right? The mall that's called Disney Springs. And I think they did a really nice job with it. I think it's attractive. There are viewpoints that guests can step out on to take a look. And again, it really does establish the identity, being that these are the springs that give this mall its name. And we can take a look at a little bit of history here. I just caught a glimpse of this, the iceworks. So there's like a historic faux ad, that's presumably from the past. So you get this sense of the palimpsest, the building up over time of different eras of history. At the same time, you see the, the Irish pub, and you see some other more modern signs of time. And we can also, I think we'll take a look here at the bottom of the, I just liked looking at the depth effect there, which is not, an effect at all. I mean, there's some painting, but it is really the depth that I guess you perceive it as. But again, to go back to this point about time, so you see the referencing of history that you might do at a place, that you might also see at a place like Victoria Gardens in Riverside, as I mentioned. But I think, there's a different effect here. It's more sporadic and sparse in terms of that referencing of history. I think what we'll do here is I'll take you through the marketplace again to see the American craftsman architecture, the 1930s on display here. And this is again the area just to the right of the landing there with the marker that is really the epicenter, the actual history, if you will, going back to the 70s of the Lake Buena Vista and then later the Walt Disney World Village. This is that point I circled before about the architecture, which I thought was a really cool point that Gordon had mentioned. There is the World of Disney. So you do see the new Craftsman version of the Disney store. I think this is tastefully done. You get, it seems to me, with the fountain, compare this fountain with the fountain from our Spanish Revival just to our right there. In the other theme land, and you do get, I think, a clear sense of how they have the time reference points via design, via architecture, and so forth. And so it's very cool. I think it's a cool way of approaching creating difference in these different areas, because I think one of the points is to say, you can only do so much. If you raised the entire downtown Disney and started from scratch, I mean, that would be impossible, right? It would be so expensive. So you can add these reference points, which are, I think, really nice here, as we're seeing at World of Disney, that are, expensive, but a more economical approach than saying, let's start from scratch and do an entirely new theme land like they did at Pandora, World of Avatar, at Animal Kingdom. So, I mean, you're talking the maybe difference of billions of dollars, right, if you start doing something like that. So, again, I think, for me, a question always becomes, in a mall space like this one, and we're coming up on the Lego store, you'll see just in front of us. I guess I'm trying to capture some of that nice architecture that's been recreated here, giving us the sense of the time period. The funny thing about it, of course, is to say, like, yeah, it references those times, but it's in a modern sense. It's not by any extent that level of weathering that's applied at Animal Kingdom. If you watch my video on Animal Kingdom, I talk a lot about when creating the fictional Harambe, they paid a lot of attention to weathering effects, to patina, to palimpsest, one layer on top of another layer, the sign that's coming apart, the decay, the rust. That stuff's very cool, and they didn't do that here. And maybe the thought is we can't do that here because that would detract from some of the higher end brands, the appeal of brands that maybe connote something more modern and classy, and we don't want to have a weathered look. It just kind of depends. It depends on the brand, right? So I don't know. I'm diverging a little bit there in terms of thinking about this, but there's the soundstage to our left, where presumably I haven't seen them, but some bands play from time to time. This does feel, I think, we're coming up on, should be the Ghirardelli store, if I recall, straight ahead. But this to me feels, very traditional in terms of a mall space, because the emphasis here, aside from the architecture, there isn't a lot going on at the front, at the facade level of the storefronts that do anything, in an explicit sense. I guess you see a little bit of that with World of Disney. But in a sense, you could say this has a traditional mall feel to it. As you're walking through this space right now, at this point in time, I don't think you would say, I'm thinking of the backstory, I'm thinking of the history, I'm thinking of the settler, I'm thinking of this town, the inhabitation, the change over time, the different eras. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. I'm just pointing that out as something to pedagogically ruminate on as we think about what history is intended to mean here at Disney Springs in Orlando, Florida. Okay, so we will leave the marketplace and we'll look at the last themed area, and this is the landing. We've seen some of it already, of course, but I wanted to show you some of the cool features here, including these kind of interesting ampa cars, if I'm saying it right. I wanted to say, though, before this, that if you have any ideas, as I was going through the landing, and this is the transportation hub as we look at the AMPA cars here, which are really cool. Took a lot of video of these. But as we look at and walk through the landing, the historical back point or foundation is that this is the transportation hub of this town, Disney Springs. But I don't ever have a sense of like what the time period is. I don't think you could base it on the cars. So these AMPA cars, and Gordon was explaining to me as we were looking at these, he knows way more about these than I do. But from what I know, these were produced in Germany between 1961 and 1968. I think somewhere near 3,000 of these eventually made their way to the United States. And as you're going to see, they can go up to 7 knots speed on water and 70 miles per hour on land. But these made their way to the U.S. in the 60s, and I think I read that somewhere near 5 to 600 are actually water ready. So obviously a lot of restoration was probably done on these. Now, it's kind of interesting, these are not actually piloted by guests. You have a captain, which is, I think, a very good thing. And they don't go necessarily that far, as you're going to see, but they're just really cool. I think from a visual standpoint, this is a very smart, it's almost what I call a ride. I mean, I mentioned the balloon ride. This is probably the second one, if you'd say, in the sense of a classic Disney ride. So this is, I guess you could say, taking Disney Springs outside of that, traditional hole or place of being a shopping mall or retail space, because you wouldn't typically see these. Now, again, go to Dubai or go to Singapore, to malls in those nations, and you're going to definitely see some of these features, right? We're going to see things outside of traditional retail because the expectation is to deliver something experientially to the guest. But as I was going through the landing, I just kept asking myself, well, to what extent am I being asked? And you see the AMPA car going there pretty slowly, just making a little loop, and it's going to it's not going to take the guests that far, although there are some different stations on the lagoon, I guess, where the AMPA cars will take you to and from. So it's a fun transportation thing. This is classic Disney, right? Disney since I was a kid, going to the Magic Kingdom, Epcot in the 70s and 80s. It was definitely something that I always remember. You had the monorail, you had the Clipper ship, you had the fun forms of transportation, you had the People Mover, which, at least in the theme park, didn't have a lot of use. It had more performative ride sense. And this is probably what's going on with the AMPA car. It's novel, it's different. It's kind of like a cruise, right? You don't necessarily go on a cruise to travel from a place to place, but it's more the experience of the travel itself. And I think this little kid probably just loved the experience. The outfits that the captains have, high five there, just a fun time. And that turntable there is also kind of cool, right? That gives the guest just the sense that they're participating in an experience. I never checked, by the way, as far as how much it costs to ride one of these, but maybe it's worth it. If that's your thing, then certainly you could have a fun experience and some cool social media to boot as well. But in any case, as we start to close the video and think about just what history means here at Disney Springs, the question becomes, what are we being asked to experience as a guest when we are part of this history? And that, I think, is just a questionable point. As I leave this video today, I'll say, I don't really know what the history is supposed to entail. I could read online. I can't really find information when I'm at Disney Springs. Again, I could talk to someone in guest relations and they give me their impressions and interpretations, but I can never get beyond the idea that essentially we're being asked to experience history, but a very subtle form of history, a form of history that doesn't have a lot of reference points that you can't dive into. And if you're a historian, of course, you want to dive into history and get a sense of it. We'll close today with the Jock Lindsay's Hangar Bar, and I'm going to take you inside in just a bit. It was kind of one of my favorite spaces during my visit to Disney Springs. But I want to go back to the USA Today story, reference that a little bit, and I thought I would ask you 3 questions about the backstory, because again, they left that article asked some of these same questions. So first off, I would say is, how effective is the Disney Springs backstory? The USA Today article suggests that essentially most people won't pick up on these historical references that we've discussed today. The second question to ask you is, does the Disney Springs backstory impact the enjoyment of the guest? So if you go there, if you've experienced it, what would you say? Offer some of your comments today here on YouTube about these questions. And the third and final question is, to what extent should other shopping malls or retail spaces employ a thematic backstory? Does it make sense? Do you agree with my assessment that the brick and mortar stores have to offer Pine and Gilmore's experience economy in order to compete with online retailers? So 3 questions to ask. Give your answers, if you will, in the YouTube comment section. So we're inside the hangar bar, and this again is referencing, if you know Indiana Jones lore, this is the pilot of Indiana Jones. Though our server made a point of saying, yeah, maybe it's a licensing thing, but they never really explicitly talk about Indiana Jones. But as you go through this space with the diving bell there and some of the other features, I think you'll see it's a really cool theme space, maybe the most immaculately themed of all the spaces I visited at Disney Springs. I'm going through the menu here, because the menu, in line with what you see on the walls, really has a lot of reference to the story of exploration. And I can't help but think, because we're in the landing, we're in the area, right, that was the Adventurers Club, that this is the tip of the hat, the homage to the Adventurers Club, because it has some of that feel. It has the exploration stuff, it has the trappings, the artifacts, and so forth. And if you remember the old Adventurers Club, that was really the big deal, right? As you walk through the spaces, it was really all about all the eclectic decor that was there. And so this maybe in some ways references that that guest who really loved that old space that's now gone from Pleasure Island, what became the landing here at Disney Springs. So for me, and we had a drink here, and it was the end of our tour, and I was pretty tired by the time that we had this drink at the hangar bar. I think we had been here close to 6 hours, so it was certainly a long day, but it was a worthwhile day. Again, if you're doing this kind of research where you want to go and explore and talk with a colleague and look at some of the material culture, the design, have some debates about what's up here in terms of the history, interview a few folks if you can get into guest relations or the appropriate space and ask them questions about it. I think it's a really fun opportunity to take an understanding of theming and immersion beyond that typical boring, tired critics level of saying it's all artifice and therefore we can't enjoy it. And I just really hate that argument. If you've read my work, you know why I always talk about challenging that argument. So we'll take a look at the springs here. We'll bring this rather long video to a close. Again, if you have the opportunity, you can go back to my 2015 video to reference what I had to say about Disney Springs when it was under construction then. I hope to see much more at this mall. I think it's very innovative in a lot of senses in drawing together these 4 eras of time or temporality in history, and maybe it offers an opportunity for us to think about how retail spaces and shopping malls can remain competitive in this radically changing world that we're experiencing. Hope you enjoyed the video feature today here at Disney Springs in Orlando, Florida. Please come back for additional video features of the Immersive Worlds Handbook.